This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. This is the first of 3 episodes over the quest for Confederate treasure, which follows Bob Brewer as he hunts for rebel gold. The Knights of the Golden Circle, or KGC, was the most powerful subversive organization ever to operate within the United States. It helped rip America apart in the Civil War, and it stealthily planned a second war of secession years after the surrender at Appomattox. Quote from Bob Brewer and Warren Getler from their book Rebel Gold, One Man's Quest to Crack the Code Behind the Secret Treasure of the Confederacy. On February 15, 1861, Texas Ranger, U.S. Marshal, and Secret Society leader Ben McCulloch would break camp with his 150 men, and he would lead a march towards San Antonio. Texas had just seceded, and he was going to take the weapons held at the Alamo from the Federals for the cause of the South. But during his march, hundreds more from his secret organization would join him. And then, after they dismounted and snuck upon the Federal garrison through the quiet evening streets, a local fraternal order, numbering 250 members, would join McCulloch. After all, these men were in the same hidden group. Among these secret society men who would join McCulloch was Lieutenant Colonel John R. Baylor, the one-time leader of Confederate Arizona. Their numbers would swell to over 1,000 as they surrounded the Alamo. These future Confederates would take the old rallying cry without a drop of blood spilled, before the Georgian General Twiggs handed over the Department of Texas to the rebels, which would ultimately allow them to invade New Mexico and secure the only Yankee-held capital during the war, Santa Fe. That fraternal order, which swelled the ranks of McCulloch, the order he was a leader of, was the Knights of the Golden Circle. I told this story in the 3rd episode of my series over the Civil War in the American Southwest, although I had no idea at that time that McCulloch was a member of the KGC. I even went over a little history of this secretive society, but this episode and this series will dive much deeper into the organization, its goals, how it worked, and specifically, their buried treasure, which laid under the earth for the time when the South would rise again. It was recommended to me by Chris Ryland, the man and friend who created the song that would become my incredible outro song. He recommended that I should read the book Rebel Gold, One Man's Quest to Crack the Code Behind the Secret Treasure of the Confederacy. Well, I did. And it was a ton of fun. But, of course, while reading it just for fun, I realized I needed a deeper understanding of the KGC. So I picked up and read Knights of the Golden Circle, Secret Empire, Southern Secession, Civil War by David Keene. I then understood that I needed to study Jesse James. So I picked up a few books on that bushwhacking outlaw hero, and I blew through them as well. Using these sources and a few more, I want to tell y'all the incredibly interesting history of this secret society and how one man from Arkansas set out to find its secret stashes of hidden gold. This is a little different from my normal series where I read countless sources to compile a history that I think is the most true and interesting. This one is more impromptu, kind of like the Pleasant Valley War episode. Therefore, I don't have the pile of sources I normally would. Regardless, this is going to be so much fun with a ton of speculation, history, mystery, and excitement. I think y'all will like it. I certainly did. So lace up your hiking boots and grab your shovel and follow me on this awesome, clandestine, and dangerous treasure hunting adventure. Bob Brewer, in October of 1993, arrived at a site he was convinced rebel gold was buried at. He was in the Ouachita Mountains of Arkansas, a place he knew very well. After all, it's where his family was from. They'd been in a little town nearby named Hatfield for a very long time, since before the Civil War. This was the third time Bob and some treasure hunter friends, a different Bob, and a man named Don, so Bob, and Don, this was the third time they had been to this site recently. Previously, they'd found many a clue under the earth, clues that he knew to look for. But they had found clues which pointed to the fact that Confederate treasure lay in this very area. But something was wrong on this trip. When they'd arrived that morning, they saw the headless effigy of a hanged body that had been riddled with bullets. The shell casings lay all over the site. And rather ominously, upside-down crosses had been spray-painted everywhere. Someone was on to what Bob was doing. Someone knew he was searching for a treasure that didn't belong to him. But Bob should have known better. Bob Brewer's family were from Hatfield, and they'd been there since forever. They'd known ex-Confederates and even Jesse James, although Bob only arrived in 1949, after his father quit the Navy after 20 years of service. Back then, Bob was just a boy. He loved the forests, and he had a connection on both sides to the area. His mother was of Indian heritage from just across the border in Oklahoma. Immediately after he arrived as a kid, Bob met his rather extended family, and he became very close with two members, Great Uncle Otis and Grandpa Ashcraft. And these mysterious men would teach Bob a lot about his ancestors' home. It was an ancient place. The American Indians had been in the area for thousands of years. The Spaniard Hernando de Soto had been to the area in 1541. The forests were dark and filled with caves and creeks and cliffs and crevices. It was a foreboding woods, if you weren't acquainted with its many secrets. Otis and Grandpa were mountain men who logged timber and had extensive mine claims, although the mines weren't necessarily panning out, nor had they ever. Still, Bob was warned not to go to the massive shafts that would swallow him up. Don't be like the Mexican who was killed here searching for something that didn't belong to him, they told him. Bob the boy got an incredible schooling from Great Uncle Otis and his family members as he grew up. Not a schooling of books, but lessons on the trees and the forest, the mountains, the canyons, and the buried treasure that lay hidden somewhere in its twists and turns. There were signs in the woods if you knew where to look. Grafted tree branches, piles of rocks, petroglyphs of snakes, dates, and strange letters. His Uncle Otis would, over the years, give him hints and threads to pull on, but he would never fully reveal what he knew to the young Bob. Otis was waiting, fleshing out his kin. Eventually, this got to Bob, and when he was a teenager, he once asked his uncle why they couldn't just go get the gold in them there hills that he keeps hearing about. The reply was, quote, "Because it belongs to someone else, and no one can touch it," end quote. Bob was learning more and more every year from his uncle until, unfortunately, in 1955, the man was killed when a 30-foot pine tree crushed his skull. It was not only a tragedy of loss of family, but also a tragedy of loss of knowledge, of secrets. Well, Grandpa Ashcraft, a very old man by now, who had lived in a log cabin built before the Civil War, realized that Otis needed a successor to his wisdom, the wisdom that Grandpa Ashcraft had passed to Otis. This man, Grandpa realized, would have to be Bob. Otis was already building the young man up for the position before his untimely passing. Grandpa Ashcraft realized he needed to continue the lessons. But Bob still had no idea what his job was going to be, even as he felt it was to be his job. Over the next few years, the old-timer would tell Bob of his old best friend, a rebel soldier named William Martin Wiley, who lived until he was nearly 100 years old in these here woods. And then Bob was told of the many times Jesse James would frequent the small town of Hatfield after his gang's robberies in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Sometimes Jesse James would even linger a bit in the woods. Bob was beginning to put the pieces together, but he still had no idea what the finished puzzle was even supposed to look like. And then fatefully, in June of 1959, Bob's woods schooling came to an end when he, like his father, joined the military, and the visits with Grandpa Ashcraft became less frequent until they came to an end. Bob would serve in the Navy for 20 years, and he'd do 2 tours in Vietnam. He would fly over 200 missions during the conflict. Unfortunately, Grandpa Ashcraft would pass away in 1971, right after Bob had returned from Asia, but before he could secure leave to go see him one final time. Bob realized it was possible the secrets he'd yearned for when he was a boy were lost forever. Eventually, after 19 years, Bob decided to quit the Navy, and just like his father had done, he returned with his wife, 3 sons and daughter, to the small town of Hatfield, Arkansas. It was 1977, and Bob knew, he just knew, he had to get to the bottom of the secrets his family had taken to the grave. Something was calling him to dig up the knowledge he and they knew were hidden in the woods and dark forests of the Ouachita Mountains. Something about Jesse James, a dead Mexican, Spanish treasure, and Confederates. The first year after Bob's return to civilian life was spent fixing up a small ranch he had purchased a few miles outside of town. But he knew his finances wouldn't last long without a job, so he began heading into town to meet with the locals, to see if he could maybe find some work. But it seemed to Bob that all the talk in town, every time he was there, it always ended in some search for buried treasure. Usually they referred to the treasure as Spanish gold, but something told him he knew it was more than that. It was something else. Some of these men were even full-time treasure hunters. Not hunters of beasts or hunters of trees like his family had been, but hunters of gold. Also like his family had been, it turns out. Well, not quite. Because despite having a ton of claims on mines, maybe his family had not been hunters, but rather protectors of gold. Eventually, Bob would gain the trust of these Arkansas mountain men, and they began to describe the secret carvings and signs they'd seen on rocks and old trees. And then he began to remember. He also began to investigate for himself. And what he found was that the men in town, they weren't lying. But what they did not understand was that these carvings had probably been made by the same men or man in all these locations, and they were much more recent than the Spanish. Eventually, Bob began a color-coded topographical field report of all of the sightings that he found. He was beginning to remember. Something in him was stirring. Maybe this was why he came back to these same mountains he grew up in. He had, after all, experience on his side. Not just experience with his kin, but also at his last station in the Navy. This was at Boca Chica in the Keys. He'd learned from one of the most famous treasure hunters of the 1970s, a man named Mel Fisher, he'd learned from Fisher just how to search for a hidden treasure. Mel Fisher, convenient name, was famous for finding sunken ships filled with whatever they'd had on deck or in the boat in the late 70s, and he was searching for the lost Spanish treasure galleon built in 1620 named Nuestra Señora de Atocha, which was sunk by a hurricane in the Florida Straits. Fisher, by the way, would find that ship, and he would get to keep everything he found, which included $400 million worth of treasure. Although sadly he'd lose a son, a daughter-in-law, and a diver friend in a freak accident while finding the treasure. Maybe some treasures are worth keeping buried. And in a twisted move that Bob would become accustomed to, Fisher the treasure hunter would, after Bob told him about his Ouachita treasure knowledge, Fisher would arrive in Bob's area in the early 90s and search heavily on land that Bob's grandpa Ashcraft used to own. Fisher would again search for more supposed Spanish gold, but having no knowledge of the land or symbols or history, he would die during this dig in Bob's backyard. And he would never recover this mysterious gold that Bob was also searching for by now in 1993. For Bob's family never spoke of Spanish gold. It was something much more recent. Now let's go back to the late 1970s. While he was searching through the archives, Bob would remember the Mexican who had been killed in the area, according to his kin. He remembered this when one of the men in town spoke about the dead Mexican. Who was this dead guy? Bob searched the county records, and sure enough, in 1884, a Mexican or Spaniard had been killed by a Hatfield resident in the woods. The dead man's name was Veneta, not a Spanish name. Bob would know. He ran the name by his wife, who was of Mexican descent, and she said it certainly was not Spanish. Bob also discovered while searching through the records that in reality, there had never been any substantial amount of gold found in Arkansas, despite so many claims and shafts and diggings and people searching for it in their hills, including his family and the family of some of his childhood friends. What's that about? I'm sure Bob thought. Well, I'm positive he thought it because he contacted a state geologist who confirmed that gold was not in the hills or the mountains, despite so many claims by so many or maybe few men. Then, Bob had a conversation with a local man who told him about another man from the area, but who eventually moved to Coolidge, Arizona. This man, William Chambers Dobson, frequently visited the area that Bob had grown up in. He came back every year. Dobson arrived consistently in the 1930s and 40s to dig for gold. Dobson claimed there was a vein of gold from Arkansas to Arizona, which is obviously impossible, unless he was not talking about an actual vein of ore, but rather a vein of hidden treasure beneath the earth, in a line from Hatfield to Coolidge, or more like Florence. But Dobson would hire, when he was in Hatfield, a local group of young men. He would have them dig in various places. He'd consult his compass and some sort of mysterious map. And then he'd pull the boys off the dig when they went deep enough. And then Dobson would have the boys dig in another area nearby. Almost like he knew of a very specific way or depth in which things were buried out in these mountains. And this will all make sense by the end of the third episode. Dobson would die of a heart attack in 1946 while out in the mountains around Hatfield, only a few hundred yards from where the mysterious Veneta had been shot. Bob found this quite curious. Dobson won't come up again later, but the area around Coolidge, Arizona certainly will. After spending all that time in the archives in 1978, Bob realized he needed to get a job. and thankfully he found a couple of them. One was a voluntary police officer, and the other was as the state apiary inspector. And if you're wondering what that is, I also wondered. It's a state bee colony inspector. So essentially he drove around his county and a neighboring one, back roads and all, to make sure that the honeybee colonies were all right. It was a work-at-your-own-hours for only 9 months out of the year kind of job. But thankfully this job would help him in his search for the secrets that his patriarchs died with. But the job was tough. People did not trust him. Not only because he was somewhat of a policeman, but also because apparently a lot of these farms he was visiting to make sure the bees were all right in were also growing marijuana. Drugs in Arkansas, you say? I'm suddenly reminded of a 1980s governor of Arkansas who allowed flights of contraband into his state. I did not inhale. Anyways, after being confronted by the barrel of a gun in '79, Bob resigned as the area beekeeper. But the job had done its job. During his excessive travels through every back road in the area he grew up in, he had noticed more markings than he thought possible. There was no way this was for a single trove of quote-unquote Spanish treasure. There seemed to be, if his kin were believed, multiple buried caches of gold. Gold of unknown origin. But probably not Spanish, right? Definitely not Spanish. With more time on his hands, Bob sat down and cataloged the various symbols, petroglyphs, and carvings that he had discovered. This is what Bob Brewer and Gettler wrote in Rebel Gold. But, real quick, Gettler wrote the book with Bob's help, obviously. So from now on, I'm going to say Gettler instead of Gettler and Brewer. So here's the quote. Bob, a committed do-it-yourselfer, wanted to decipher the signs that he had observed and meticulously recorded. By now, his inventory of carved hieroglyphics ran the gamut, from countless letters and numbers with odd flourishes, to crosses and crescent moons, to bizarre stick-figure depictions of animals, snakes, birds, turtles, including one laying eggs, horses, mules, and deer. These were almost always laid out in groupings, seldom singularly. Most were at eye level of a person standing or riding horseback. From these etched tableaus, he knew there were messages to be discerned. He inferred that the key indicators were for distance and direction. Others, he surmised, indicated numerical compass headings and perhaps even the outline of topographical features in the immediate area. What appeared to be, say, the carved letter Y could actually be the confluence of two streams. End quote. So quick aside. I believe this is also the reason for many ancient American Indian petroglyphs. Find X at Y. This is the place where we do X ceremony because this place is Y. There is game here, there is water here. One of my very intelligent listeners subscribes to the idea that the amount of circles in a Anasazi spiral petroglyph, the amount of circles in it lets one know the day's travel to the next destination for a particular important spot or pueblo. So whoever carved these in the rocks of western Arkansas may have been doing the same thing. You just needed the key to decipher the meanings of the symbols. Bob didn't have that key yet. Us Anglos can't decipher the Anasazi and Puebloan petroglyphs, although we attempt to. Can Bob decipher these symbols left by whoever the heck it was? Back at home, Bob made incredible notes and sketches upon topographical maps that he saw of every single tree limb graft, tree carving, and rock piling, and more. He was creating a database, as Fisher had shown him how to do in the Keys. Eventually, Bob realized most of these markers formed a sort of grid. A grid that emanated out of the famous nearby Smoke Rock Mountain. The mountain his grandpa Ashcraft had spent nearly every night in his entire life, exploring, or rather, protecting. Bob mapped all of this information and measured it all, and he began to walk the forest, at first in Spanish measurements, but that did not pan out. It's here, as the 1980s approached, that Bob realized this was no Spanish treasure. In fact, there may not be any sort of treasure at all. Yet, why had so many men searched, protected, and even died, trying to find something here? Men that he respected, his own kin. There had to be more than just rumors. In February of 1979, after a few months of questions from neighbors and friends about his wanderings in the woods, and his unemployment, and after a little bit of financial stress, Bob found another job. This time it was the town's utilities superintendent. Specifically, he was to fix the water utilities, which he did, which earned him the praise of the governor of Arkansas. Yes, that very same Arkansas governor. He did this job for a while. He spent a little bit of exhausting time in Texas, and then by the mid-'80s, Bob was back near Hatfield, where he and his wife lived comfortably as empty nesters. Comfortably enough for Bob to hunt for his treasure full time. The treasure his kin had protected. The treasure so many were after. The treasure that had been buried by a secretive group in the hopes of resurrecting a fallen empire. The South will rise again. By the late 80s, Bob was back in the field searching for his family's secret, and it's here he remembered the grafted trees from his youth. I'll let Gettler describe what Bob discovered. Quote, walking along indicated directional lines, he began to notice that select trees, almost exclusively red and white oaks, had a pattern of grafted limbs or oddly shaped trunks which, he thought, could not be naturally occurring. Some had grown into the shape of football uprights. Others looked like a half-finished scaffolding, with perfectly vertical limbs sprouting off perfectly horizontal branches. Some took the shape of T's or crosses. It appeared as if 19th century pioneers had snapped the trunks of saplings and tied them into right-angled contortions, using twine that would disintegrate. By now, these were no mere landmarks, but giant, sculptured signposts, or in some cases, neat rifle sights, showing a traveler that his compass bearing was correct as it sliced through the center of the marker tree. Other contorted oaks had large bent-knee knobs knitted into their trunks, providing a waist-high, this way indicator. End quote. Was Bob onto something, or was he crazy? He admittedly thought the same thing, and he wished his kin were around to help him. Amazingly, Bob found around Smoke Rock Mountain some 65 inscriptions on trees and rocks, inscriptions that included a cross, a bell, a heart, a legless horse or mule, a legless bird, a priest-like figure, and a host of letters, symbols, and numbers. So those will come up again, constantly. They appeared to look like they were from American Indians, but Bob knew they were not. One particular marker around the mountain was a beech tree, and on it were so many markers that Bob felt that it had to be the key. Specifically on the tree was a certain priest figure. But by now, after over 100 years, the carvings were stretched and disfigured. Even still, Bob recorded them and fixed them. On that tree, he even found the much more recent carved words of Otis Ashcraft, 1924, his great uncle. And then he found, higher up on the tree, carved long ago, the words First THESS, Thessalonians, and then the numbers 2, 3. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3, which reads, For our exhortation was not of deceit, nor of uncleanliness, nor in guile. On the opposite side of the tree were the letters JAS, with 3 dots around it in the shape of a triangle. This, Bob thought, was a reference to James chapter 3, verse 3, which reads, "Behold, we put bits in the horses' mouths, that they may obey us, and we turn about their whole body." Bob would call this beech tree the Bible tree, and it was indeed the key. Following his Bible tree key and his notes on his map, Bob set out into the wilderness in search of what he was told did not belong to him and what no one should touch. And he found incredible things. Caves with symbols, depressions in the ground, and waterlogged tunnels that had collapsed. And all of them were the same distance apart from markers that told of their existence. These were not Spanish measurements. Rather, they were old U.S. surveying measurements of 660 feet, or 1/8 of a mile. So, this was not Spanish at all. This was not ancient in any way. This was American. This was Southern. After realizing that it wasn't some sort of Spanish treasure and these markings were in fact made by not early Americans but post-Civil War Americans, Bob began to rethink everything. Here is Gettler again, quote, "By early 1990, he began to find markers systematically. Typically the clues were carved in tree bark or chiseled in stone outcroppings. But the symbolic signposts could also take the form of strategically placed rocks or groupings of rocks. The stone markers were often shaped like an elongated diamond or trowel. Some resembled large arrowheads, and some even looked like a boot. Moreover, Bob began to realize that the rusted junk metal that he occasionally discovered with his metal detector while walking lines could hold some significance for the overall geometric grid. Until this point, he had discounted all such seemingly random findings: horseshoes, mule shoes, plow points, pick and axe heads, wagon and stove parts. He had assumed that the stuff had been lost or deliberately tossed by miners or woodsmen working in the area long ago. But was it really junk? No, the pattern was too consistent, too linear, in fact, to be a coincidence. He eventually concluded that constellations of abandoned spare parts had been placed at calculated distances and then buried 4 to 6 inches underground. That depth of burial, he realized, was just enough for concealment, but within range of a magnetic compass needle to mark the ferrous target below the surface." End quote. So all of these years is over a decade. He's been digging every now and then. He got a metal detector and he was finding all this junk. Obviously, Gettler just lays out it was not junk. He then goes on to describe how a magnetic compass would be able to point towards a spot in the ground, as in a magnetic compass could find something buried 6 inches below. He does a very good job. Let's just say we've mostly lost this knowledge of how to hide buried treasure, but our ancestors would have known exactly what to look for if they hovered a Spanish dip needle compass above the earth, which right above some such buried metal, which would have thrown off the compass. They then would have dug up said object and seen its orientation or its trajectory or the direction of where it was pointing, and then they would have followed that line while repeating the process again and again until their Spanish dip needle compasses would have let them discover the mother lode, a term you will hear a lot later on in the other 2 episodes. Bob right now, in the 1990s, is realizing this is the method, that whoever buried this treasure, this is the method they were using. And Bob began to decipher some of the clues around this time as well. He saw lines under the ground, which made a map that pointed to something. And by now, Bob's wife Linda was joining in on the intoxicating hunt, and she quickly began to read the signs and markers with him. Which takes us to April 1991. Bob found an area by a creek bed with weird piled stones, a notch on a tree, and it was at a place where several of these underground lines merged and crossed. The following day, he brought out his wife, his gun, and his metal detector. And lo and behold, when it pinged, he dug up a metal axe head that had a notch on it. He oriented the notch and found that it pointed to a weird rock. He walked over to the weird rock and found another piece of metal which pointed to the tree with a notch in it. The three objects made a triangle. So Bob headed to the center of the triangle, where his metal detector went off the charts. Here is what happened next. Quote, as Bob started probing with the shovel, he realized that the object was buried deeper than usual. He carefully dug through the soft, loamy soil. At about 18 inches, the shovel struck something that he knew was neither metal nor rock. Dropping to his knees, he reached into the hole and felt smooth glass. He groped again, this time retrieving a patina-coated, pint-sized fruit jar with his trembling hands. It was filled with gold and silver coins. End quote. Bob had finally found buried treasure. He softly told his wife, who immediately ran over in excitement. She would tell him, well, at least now I know you're not crazy. All the coins were U.S. minted gold pieces in various denominations, printed between 1802 and 1889, and the date on the bottom of the jar was June 1903. So how did Bob find this treasure? Well, he found it by interpreting secret codes and symbols used by an organization that helped jumpstart the Civil War, a society that had, before secession, wanted to conquer Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, a secret society known as the Knights of the Golden Circle. And after the war, they planned on reviving the Confederacy with the help of strategically hidden and buried treasure. Treasure that was easy to find if you knew the signs, the symbols, if you were in possession of certain clues, or if you were initiated. Let's now go back in time, way back, and talk about the Knights of the Golden Circle. The Mystic Order of the Knights of the Golden Circle was a militant, blood oath-bound secret society whose main mission was to promote Southern rights and expand America's empire. KGC members were mostly Southerns, although Northern men could join, if they were sympathetic to the South. Many important men of the 1850s and 60s were members. Sam Houston was a member. Presidential hopeful John Breckinridge, as well as Jefferson Davis. There were Mexican-American war heroes, Texas Rangers, newspaper editors, ex-governors, congressmen, senators, judges, active and high-ranking members of the military, and even actors. Specifically, a very famous actor who would shoot to stardom in 1865. Like many secret societies, the KGC had levels. The first level was the military degree, and it was called the Knights of the Iron Hand. In 1859, there were 7,000 of these men around the nation, with many of them being in Texas. The second degree was the Knights of the True Faith. They were the bankers and suppliers of the KGC. The third and highest degree was called the Knights of the Columbian Star. These men at the top were influential, wealthy, and powerful men, and they did not write down their minutes or their plans, nor did they pass them down the other degrees. The KGC left virtually no written records. I am an officer at the Elks Lodge, which was formed by Northerners after the war to help out veterans. All our meetings are meticulously recorded. And while there are no real degrees per se, any member can attend meetings. The KGC was much more secretive, and dare I say seditious. Members of the KGC were gathered together in lodges that they called castles. By 1859, there would be 32 castles in Texas alone. Every castle had a sentry guarding the outer door during meetings. If you wanted in, you had to know the password. Each meeting began with a prayer and then a pro-Southern Empire speech. and the meetings would end with the Knights of the Iron Hand doing drills. A whole bunch of symbolism and words and beliefs of the KGC are pretty clearly tied directly to the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, which of course is multinational, and so too was the KGC. They had recruiters in Europe, specifically in Germany, Austria, France, and Italy. The KGC wanted talented men, ex-soldiers of the European wars. Of course, you had to swear a blood oath once on American soil. An 1861 exposition that unveiled a lot of the KGC symbolism wrote this, quote, "The symbols were a large bronzed crescent or new moon, set with 15 stars, a large temple, under the dome of which shone a beautiful representation of the noonday sun, and around the corona of which were affixed 15 stars. To these were added the skull and crossbones. Now for the language of the symbols. The crescent represents the growing Southern Confederacy. The temple, with its glowing sun and 15 stars, foreshadows the glorious sunny South under the benign influence of a fully matured Southern government, extending its borders through Cuba, Mexico, and Central and South America. The skull and crossbones signify death to all abolitionists and opposers of Southern independence." End quote. To become a member, you had to swear an oath of loyalty to the group, keep everything a secret, expand the order, and ultimately help the Knights field an army to carry out their grand plan of empire. Although by 1860, the mission of the Knights had shifted to secession. The ritual to join is mostly unknown, but apparently included very solemn steps that seemed to mimic a failed filibuster excursion into Cuba, where the participants were killed. So I imagine the initiate to this mystery school was ceremonially murdered and brought back from the dead like so many other societies. One person described it as something the initiate would never forget, and another called it a magnificent spectacle. One newspaperman was told by an ex-member some of what was said. It could be hearsay or it could be true. He wrote that the KGC exists to not only cultivate the martial pride of the people, but also to render substantial aid to weak and oppressed nationalities. We are soldiers whose objects are to conquer certain countries, and thereby spread over them the genial influences of our own institutions. After being told this, the initiate is then told of the magnificent conquests of past empires, Rome, Spain, Great Britain. The officer then says, "Why should we not adopt a similar policy? See what California did for us, what Cuba will do for us. Every inch of territory is that much additional wealth. We threw out a colony in Mexico. It revolted and we won Texas. Now, one of the brightest stars in our empire. Now, gentlemen, are you willing to be united with us?" The initiate is then given the oath and told to keep all secrets of the association, to stand by the flag of the Legion, to obey orders, and abide by the Articles of War, as promulgated by the Commander-in-Chief and his staff, and to march whithersoever ordered. But where exactly were the Knights of the Golden Circle going to march, and who was given the orders? The KGC was most likely a mixture of Jeffersonian principles that had been carried in Southerners since the Revolution. Freedom based on natural law. The ultimate political power resided in the individual. So those principles mixed with the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. Freemasonry was taking off in the South, especially after the 1830 nullification crisis, which saw South Carolina, ever the rebel, fighting against the Federals over tariffs. As a matter of fact, the headquarters of the Freemasons in the U.S. was in Charleston at that time and in 1860, right before the war kicked off. Every one of the temple's documents, as a matter of fact from 1801 up until that point in 1860, were mysteriously burned. The quote-unquote intellectual father of the KGC was certainly John C. Calhoun, and even KGC members of the era would have confirmed that. One of their first passwords, that we know of, was Calhoun spelled backwards, the Nahuatl-sounding Nuolac. Then in 1835, Southern rights societies began popping up in the South. Most, if not all, of the leaders of these men were Freemasons. They would hold secret meetings in which they discussed repelling the flood of abolitionism propaganda and legislative action, both pouring down from the north. They would form the infrastructure that the latter KGC would use. They also talked of a golden circle, a geographical area with the South at the top and northern South America at the bottom. This golden circle would be transformed by the South into southern slavery colonies that would allow the South to be independent of the North. After the Mexican-American War, these men grew even more excited to take more of northern Mexico and especially Cuba. And it is at this point the filibusters began. Those filibusters were private army invasions to take land and make it part of the United States. I've talked about them before, but they were largely funded and formed by these Southern rights societies. By 1850, another important group, the Order of the Lone Star, sprang up, which had pretty much the same views and goals as these Southern rights societies, and I will talk about them again shortly. The real person behind the KGC may have been a man named Albert Pike, a distant cousin to Zebulon Montgomery Pike. Pike was a pro-Southerner, pro-slavery, Mexican-American war hero, expansionist, and 33rd degree Mason. He quite literally wrote the handbook for the Masons. He titled it Morals and Dogma. Timeline Earth listeners or Bill Cooper watchers will be aware of Pike. Now, Pike may have had English backers, cannot confirm that. And these English backers wanted to split the nation apart and pick up the pieces. But Pike was suspected of truly being the leader of the KGC. He was the man behind the scenes. The man who put up the front man. A man I will talk about right now. We are told the KGC was created by a Virginian named George W. L. Bickley. Bickley was born in 1823 to a poor family, and when he was quite young, his father died. And then his mother all but abandoned her son. So by the age of 12, George Bickley ran away. The next decade and a half of his life saw him moving constantly. Alabama, Indiana, North Carolina, back to Virginia, Ohio, and then the South again. In North Carolina, the young man married and fathered a son, but when his wife died, he gave the child to relatives. By 1850, at 26 years old, he was again in southwestern Virginia, and this time he began to learn medicine from a local doctor. In 1850, he listed his occupation as a phrenologist, the practice of measuring skulls, a practice that in this era was completely legitimate. According to biographers of George, the man was a schemer. He was also ambitious, quick-witted, handsome, well-liked, and resourceful. But most of all, he was hungry to do something in this life. Hungry to make a name for himself, to have an impact. He began down this path as a well-read, intelligent writer and public speaker. No one knows where he learned world history and his exceptional grasp of the English language, but he certainly had somewhere along his exciting journey in life thus far, maybe under the tutelage of Albert Pike. He further steamrolled his ambitions by becoming a professor at Cincinnati's Eclectic Medical Institute at age 27. He helped himself get the job by straight up lying about his resume, but that was no bother to him. The man had not gone to medical school in the East and in Europe, like he said, but no one questioned him. As a professor, he would write books on phrenology, botany, and a history book on the settlement and the Indian Wars of his hometown in Virginia. He also wrote a novel. I would actually kind of like to read it. It's titled Atalaska, or The Strange and Mysterious Family of the Cave of Genreva. It is described as an anti-slavery novel, surprisingly. But it also talks heavily about manifest destiny, a theme which will captivate the young, enterprising man. Or at least he was enterprising. In 1853, George would marry up when he wed a wealthy widow named Rachel Dodson. She was from a family of a very rich Cincinnati banker. He could now be a man of leisure. He still stayed busy, though. After moving to central Ohio with his wife to their sprawling farm, George took up newspaper editing, real estate, and overseas investing. Places like the Dominican Republic, and even in Tsarist Russia. But all the while, there was something troubling him. That would be the liberal Republicans. So to counter that, he began a publication and urged Democrat leaders to start their own conservative newspapers around the nation of 31 states. His publication, although short-lived, was called Bickley's West American Review. Interestingly, in one article, he wrote that the U.S. Capitol should be moved out of the swamps of D.C. and into the hills of the Ozarks. He said this because the young nation would soon include, quote, a part of the British possession, the West Indies and Mexico, end quote. Clearly, he was already forming the outline of the Knights of the Golden Circle as early as 1854. At the time, Democrats, especially young Democrats, were espousing the need for worldwide Jeffersonian republicanism. They claimed it would bring about world peace by toppling all monarchies and emperors. Like I said in my Zeb Pike series, the revolutionary government of the United States of America was hungry for spreading her ideals. I'm sure if men like Doc Robinson had survived, he would have been a strong proponent and upper member of the KGC. In the mid-1850s, George would end up joining a secret society known as the Brotherhood of the Union. This society espoused the need for U.S. expansionism to improve the lives of the working class of America by offering them land and opportunities. This society didn't meet in lodges or castles, but instead in circles. And like the future KGC, they had a supreme council, code words, handshakes, and secrecy. Not content with one society, George also joined the Know Nothing Party. You know, the party with the incredible flag that says Native Americans beware of foreign influence. And yes, Albert Pike was a member of the Know Nothing Party. That party would soon change their name to the American Party, and they would run Millard Fillmore for president. He would lose that 1856 election, and then, due to the growing differences between the North and the South, the party would dissolve. Interestingly, George also formed a militia unit. You know, I love reading for this show and discovering something I had previously been completely ignorant about. And I'll read from Keene's Knights of the Golden Circle book now. Another of Bickley's avocations was the formation of a drill company consisting of 60 young men whom he planned to equip with dazzling uniforms so that they could travel the globe and perform intricate military exhibitions. Such drill squads, usually connected with local militia units, were prevalent, especially in the South, and their competitions provided opportunities for military-minded men to get together and share their perspectives. Bickley's drill company provided him with a ready source of recruits that he shifted to the KGC when he established its first chapters in Scioto County and Cincinnati. End quote. Unfortunately for George, though, all of this scheming would come to an end when his wife kicked him out and stripped him of her assets. And why would she do this? Because he was attempting to transfer all her wealth to himself. So in 1857, he was back at the school as a professor, and this is where the KGC really takes off. The next year, he'd created the society's emblem and had them made into a pin to be worn. He also attempted to raise capital for his future ventures, but that didn't work out so well, and eventually he was forced to move south. His coworkers and the people around him started to see the man for what he really was. One coworker even described him as, quote, an ignorant pretender, as restless and scheming as he was shallow, very vain of his person, exceedingly fond of military display, and constantly engaged either in devices to borrow money and crazy schemes of speculation. End quote. Once back in the South, George got busy creating and promoting his secret society, and eventually he somehow merged his with an already existing one known as the Order of the Lone Star. George's focus for his fledgling society was the promotion of manifest destiny and the preservation of Southern rights. Now, how he did this merger is unknown and honestly kind of astounding. But it would not surprise me if Albert Pike was the reason for this merger. The order had 15,000 members and 50 chapters in 10 southern states, mostly Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, which is how there were already so many castles in Texas when the war broke out. But there were also chapters in Baltimore and New York. And where did the chapter in New York meet? None other than the Tammany Hall. So all of a sudden, George's little KGC was nationwide, and it included powerful people. I learned something very interesting, though. Like a lot of pieces of previous episodes seem to be coming together. One of the main things the Order of the Lone Star did was promote and fund filibusters. I talked about a few in the lead up to the Civil War, and I also discussed quite a few in my Pike series. Think of the Nolan Party. Think 5th Texas's Major Samuel Nicaragua Lockridge, who was with William Walker in Nicaragua. Lockridge would lead and perish in the charge that took the Valverde Battery. He would also become a member of the KGC. Curiously, the Order of the Lone Star had been formed in 1851 by Cuban and Southern expansionist adventurers after a failed filibuster into Cuba that same year. That filibuster saw the men all executed or arrested by the Spanish on the island. Filibustering was no joke. Most countries in the hemisphere outlawed any participation of it, including the United States. Yet, as I mentioned in the Pike series, some U.S. presidents actively promoted them anyways, while of course keeping their distance from them. These filibusters were under the guise of freeing the locals from tyrannical rule, but usually fortune and glory were the desired outcomes. If you'll recall, William Walker wanted to be president of Nicaragua and reinstate slavery. The OLS was very similar to the future KGC, and in fact, George Bickley probably borrowed most of their existing infrastructure. But importantly, by the time the two groups merged, the OLS was already embedded in most southern states' governments. They had already funded expansionist causes, and they were now promoting secession. The leader of the OLS was a man named John Anthony Quitman. He had been a war hero in the Mexican-American War who had stormed the gates of Mexico City, something you'll hear about in my Mexican War series. He had also been temporary military leader of Mexico during the U.S.'s occupation. His time in Mexico did not leave him with a good taste in his mouth, to put it mildly. Mostly because the country was filled with Mexicans, whom he called a, quote, bastard and robber race, incapable of self-government and fit only for servitude and military rule, end quote. Quitman also ran as vice president in the 1852 election. He was running in the Southern Rights Party that did not live past that election. But all of this allowed the OLS to infiltrate a huge strata of the American nation's elite, from the federal level right down to the local. And Quitman was very good friends with Albert Pike, and another man I will talk about towards the end. Quitman also had heavily funded the failed Lopez Cuban filibuster, and he was ready to fund a bunch more. But alas, the Franklin Pierce administration, in response to Northern complaining and whining, issued a proclamation against a planned and funded second filibuster to the island. Quitman, in disgust, then ran and won a U.S. congressional seat from Mississippi and D.C. He would, until his suspicious death in 1858, advocate for the cause of the South and the cause of the filibusterers. 1858 is also the year George Bickley's KGC and the Order of the Lone Star merged, thus making George the leader of this vast and sprawling secret society. 4 years before that, in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed by President Pierce, which overrode the Missouri Compromise, which established, or rather strengthened, the Mason-Dixon line, which basically separated the country into northern free states and southern slave states. Pierce was now allowing slavery in Kansas, which led to Bloody Kansas, which I will talk about in the next episode when I discuss Jesse James at length. So, Bloody Kansas and other Northern abolitionist actions proved to the South that the North was hell-bent on ending the Southern's way of life as they knew and enjoyed it. But all of this action by the Federals proved to the KGC that protecting Southern rights was equally as important as expanding the U.S. empire. But why expand the U.S. empire anyways? If these Northerners and black Republicans are going to try to impose their way onto ours, that was the thinking, why should the KGC, after, say, filibustering into Mexico, why would they plead with the federal government for assistance and admission into the Union, just like Texas had done? Why would they do that if the Northerners were going to fight them every step of the way? Why not just secede from the Union constitutionally, form up militias led by Mexican-American war heroes, and take the Caribbean and Mexico? Heck, add northern South America in there as well. In 1859, George Bickley felt the South was fortified enough, and it was now time to focus on Baltimore and D.C. So he began recruiting and fundraising around the nation's capital, which at that time was pretty pro-Southern. Secession wasn't quite on the table yet, but for the KGC, invading the mineral-rich and sparsely populated northern Mexico certainly still was. When Bickley arrived at the Baltimore Castle, he would have certainly met a now notorious member who was also an actor. That man would be John Wilkes Booth. And while in Baltimore, George Bickley would start a newspaper titled American Cavalier, a military journal devoted to the extension of American civilization. So clearly an expansionist newspaper, right north of the nation's capital. But the paper was very short-lived. I will quote Keene about this magazine, American Cavalier. The first, and perhaps only, issue, dated May 28, 1859, is an eclectic array of articles on manifest destiny, definitions of filibustero and political words, military tactics, as well as reports from correspondents in Cuba, Mexico, and other locations. In an article titled What We Mean by American Civilization, the editor notes that it is our duty to enlarge the area of its influence until the whole continent shall be thus Americanized. End all quotes. Just remember President Thomas Jefferson's words from the Pike episode. Despite the Order of the Lone Star's original goal of obtaining Cuba, this particular newspaper, ran by George, completely gave up on any hope of ever acquiring Cuba, but instead focused on northern Mexico. Pike's words, Zebulon Montgomery's words, could not have been lost on these men, who no doubt knew what he wrote some 50 years prior. Zeb would write in 1808 that it would only take 20,000 American auxiliary forces allied with Mexican insurgents to beat Spain. And then the resounding defeat of Mexico in the Mexican-American War, which ended only a decade prior to this 1858 era, it further proved that America could easily win yet another engagement. And this one wouldn't go to the halls of Montezuma, just to the northern states, Chihuahua, Sonora. Surely, you young Americans whose fathers fought in that war, and who need adventure themselves, would be willing to sign up and expand the boundaries of Manifest Destiny Nation. This was indeed the attitude of young Americans at the time. He was tapping into something. George was going by a pseudonym, but he writes this in probably the only edition of the newspaper. He wrote, quote, "The fact is we want to fight, but how to get it is the question. The war horse is saddled, but he has no rider. The cannon is charged, with no one to fire it. While this is the case here, the Mexicans have just about finished the job of killing each other, and as their strength will be inadequate to the completion of the job, they are imploring the Americans to come in, finish the work, quietly bury them, and take their country in payment for the job. Who will be the executioner? Who will put this man out of his misery?" End quote. So Benito Juarez was a liberal Indian revolutionary leader in Mexico in the late 1850s. He fought against the conservative government, and it was a brutal war. Basically, it pitted the liberals against the Catholics and wealthy conservatives, and Juarez and the liberals would ultimately win. But funny enough, France was seeing the same situation that George was, and the Europeans ultimately enacted what the KGC wanted when they invaded Mexico and installed Maximilian I. The Knights of the Golden Circle were unable to implement their plans because of the coming conflict in the U.S. You may have heard of it. And that quote above by George Bickley, that is why the war between the states was able to be so ferocious. An entire generation of men raised by fighters, who themselves were raised by fighters, who themselves were, you get the point. What were these young men to do if there was no hope of expansion or conquering or fighting? Become a financialized civilization with weak men? No, we know what that leads to. They wanted no part of that. They needed a fight. They needed a cause. If it wasn't Cuba anymore, or Nicaragua, then let's make it the northern states of Mexico. They were weak, after all, they're vulnerable. They would add to our glory. And this wasn't a crazy thing for these filibustering men in groups like the KGC to contemplate. In 1840, the four northern states of Mexico, Nuevo León, Coahuila, Sonora, and Chihuahua, had tried to form their own republic, modeled after Texas. They were going to call it the Republic of the Rio Grande. But Mexico's forces stopped it. And now, during this Guerra de Reforma, Juarez was pitting the northern states against each other so they would stay out of the war and let Juarez, succeed against the Catholic conservative government in Mexico City. And again, these states were barely populated with humans, but very populated with minerals. Again, if you recall my Zeb series, when he was walking through northern Mexico and he saw all the people in chains or skinny and nearly naked working the mines, while the men who ran the mines were fat and able to feed these American spies a great meal. Americans knew the weakness of the northern Mexican states, and between the late 1840s and late 1850s, 5 American filibuster expeditions would attempt to take over parts of it. The most notorious one, of course, being the Californian expedition, led by Henry Crabb. They were almost immediately captured after crossing the border, and 87 of the 100 Americans were systematically executed. Crabb saw that the Reform War was tearing apart Mexico, so he gathered an army and invaded from southern Arizona in 1857. But it wasn't just his idea. A rebel Mexican leader invited the American and his army to come colonize northern Sonora. One reason was to help him fight in the war against Juarez, and another reason was to help him kill the pesky, you guessed it, Apache. Problem was, this Mexican rebel had a bunch of liberals in his ranks, and they decided they didn't like this plan, so they destroyed the Americans. Crabb would have his head cut off and kept in a jar. Despite this, though, there were committed Mexican KGC members, or at least adjacent members, who swore that if the Americans invaded, they would be able to wrest control of the land from the fractured Mexican government. One such leader was a man named Santiago Vidaurri. He was the governor of Nuevo León, and he had a personal militia and plenty of wealth. But he wasn't the only person George Bickley claimed to be making deals with in Mexico. It's unverified, but George claimed in 1859 that he was in talks with 4 governors and even Benito Juarez himself. George claimed that if his army took care of the conservative governments and armies, the KGC filibusterers will be left unimpeded by Juarez's armies. The Knights of the Golden Circle wrote in an article, quote, We have the invitation of 4 Mexican state governors to come and shall receive their cooperation if only we take care of the people of those states. End quote. Take care of. It was also in 1859 when it appears the KGC's name was first printed. The San Francisco Daily Evening Bulletin printed the name and claimed that the filibusterers were planning on filling their pockets with products of other people's labors. And this editor was talking about the fundraising bonds that George Bickley was selling. It was a whole thing. I didn't really go into it, but the paper claimed they were also raising an army of 10,000 Americans to invade, and the U.S. government was backing them. Bickley wrote back to the paper pretty much confirming everything except for the part about his fundraising bonds being a lie. He wrote that, yes, the U.S. government has our back. Yes, we are going to invade Mexico. But actually, we have 13,000 men ready for any honorable work. In August of 59, the 3rd degree, the highest, the Knights of the Columbian Star, they met for the first time, and they met in White Sulphur Springs, Virginia. There were 1,200 men in attendance. Ben McCulloch was probably there. U.S. Secretary of War, U.S. Secretary of the Interior, South Carolina's governor, and a congressman from that state, cabinet members from the sitting president's office, active military commanders, and fire eaters from the South were all said to have been in attendance. And if you can't remember what a fire eater was, that was someone who rode around the South preaching the future is secession. Dirty Shirt Scurry was a fire eater. They were passionate men who were prepping the average Southern to secede from the Union. And I found out recently that a few of them were paid by Great Britain, whether they knew it or not. And if you'll recall, Great Britain was also paying and arming the abolitionists. Great Britain wanted this coming war, as I have reiterated before. After all, if the U.S. kept growing unchecked, they would truly rival and even outpace England. At this meeting in Virginia, a reporter snuck in and eavesdropped on some of what was said. He wrote that Bickley talked about taking Mexico for the South, and then he had 13,000 men at the ready. The crowd loved it. He asked the wealthy to back them at home while they marched abroad. He also brought up the growing differences between the North and the South, and suggested it would be a good idea for the South to get practice abroad for when the war comes to their front door. The crowd was in agreement. A later meeting was guarded and the reporter wasn't able to attend, but he said it was entirely composed of military men. The reporter apparently met George Bickley at one time, and he described him as being 5'10" with sharp blue eyes and a heavy beard. He wrote, quote, "Few young men will talk with him 5 minutes without catching his enthusiasm." End quote. It seems a lot of people were catching his enthusiasm. Bickley, to raise funds, was selling, this is what I was talking about earlier, them bonds. He was selling $1,000 bonds, and quite a few attendees bought said bonds. And this is important for the latter half of the series, the treasure hunting portion. For because of coming circumstances, the war, this invasion into Mexico will never happen. But what will happen to all that money raised? The reporter asked Bickley about his plans, and Bickley pretty much told him, look, the South needs to expand into the Gulf and into Mexico. These people cannot govern themselves, and they will be in anarchy unless the United States, or at least the South, rules over them. When asked about the coming Civil War, Bickley said if the KGC takes the Gulf and Mexico, there won't be any need for it, and he might even be able to stop it. But in the very next sentence, when asked who he wants to run for office in 1860, Bickley says he hopes a Republican wins, so that the South will be forced to secede. The reporter concludes with this, quote, "I think Bickley a most dangerous man, and if he is not stopped, he will do the whole country an incalculable injury. He is playing with the most dangerous passions of the Southern people." End quote. Shortly after the convention, a 60-page booklet was printed by the American Legion of the KGC. It seems to have been made public, and you can still read it today. It was the laws, rules, and regulations, and then it had a brief text outlining the coming invasion. It said, quote, "Soldiers, the time approaches when we must take the field. Let us think for a moment what we propose: the invasion of a nation by a new and vigorous race, the overthrow of old social systems and the establishment of new ones, the disarming of a hostile faction and the erection of peace establishments, the overthrow of prejudice and the indoctrination of the people with new ideas of peace and prosperity." End quote. Bickley wrote the article, or maybe Pike did, but Bickley probably was told what to write, and he concludes that there shall be an American empire from Canada to Patagonia, and it would all be taken in, quote-unquote, defensive colonization. And by defensive colonization, the KGC meant defense against the North. Here is the leaked initiation that was occurring by late 1860 of the second or the financial degree of the KGC. "There is but one possible chance to maintain our independence and rights in the Union: the acquisition of a sufficient quantity of territory in the South, to procure an equal representation in Congress, by and through a system of defensive colonization. If the separations so long threatened between the North and South be carried out, then it will be the natural policy of the Southern Confederacy to foster any scheme which looks to the Americanization and Southernization of the Republic of Mexico." End quote. In the booklet were also moral and political codes, how to run your castle, and how to establish a mixed-race government, and all sorts of important steps for a new nation to make, and how to conduct themselves. It also, curiously, hints at Mexican castles who were to help them once they arrived. I mean, this booklet even described the uniforms they were going to wear, how to dress their horses, how many horses to have, what arms to bear, how many servants to take. It is a legit booklet. Another important aspect of the booklet's Articles of Laws section was that it stipulated that no knight may go against the interest of the U.S. government. But then a few articles later, it states that all Americans have the unquestioned constitutional right to secede if the U.S. government becomes tyrannical. It then goes on to say, besides, the U.S. government cannot force a group of people to not enter into another nation when they are invited. Bickley wrote, quote, "When a nation has lost its nationality, where society has given up its existence, then the territory so occupied is thrown open to adventurers from civilized nations, and may be seized by them for the purposes of Christian civilization." End quote. The booklet also states that they have 15,000 members now and $2 million, but they need even more men and money. The men, though, the ones that participate in the invasion, will receive from 640 acres to 3,200 acres of land in Mexico, depending on your rank. And once Mexico is taken, the Caribbean will be asked to join, and if they decide they don't want to, taken through conquest. The Knights of the Golden Circle were calling this Golden Circle a great democratic monarchy and a republican empire, which shall vie in grandeur to the old Roman Empire. Although this was only told to the highest members. We know it was written because someone leaked these goals in that same year of 1859. This meeting in Virginia and the printing of this material, it all happened in August and September of 1859. But something very important to the growing tension in the nation happened in October of that year. That would be the terrorist attack by John Brown and his raid on Harper's Ferry. The 23 terrorists, who were hoping to incite a slave revolt, seized the U.S. Armory in that city and held it for a day, before Colonel Robert E. Lee led the U.S. Marines to capture and kill them. After he was hanged, it was found that not only did many Northern abolitionists financially back him, but John Brown was now being called a hero and a martyr. This galvanized the South against the North, and it only confirmed their fears that the North was going to arm and help the slaves kill Southerners. By winter of '59, the talk of secession was everywhere. Committee of Public Safety groups were forming in nearly every Southern state, and armed vigilance committees were seen everywhere below the Mason-Dixon line. Extreme Southern states' rights candidates were propelled into power as well. The governor of Virginia said that abolitionists must be met and crushed, and that it was now time for the South to organize and arm. Bickley's planned invasion of Mexico was supposed to be for 1860, but something else was looming that would forever stall his dreams of empire. Although going into the following year, his hopes were still high. In December of '59, President Buchanan spoke to Congress, and most of what he said was about Mexico. He blamed the conservative Mexican government on the murders of Americans in the country. He claimed Mexico should be prosperous and rich, not backwards and poor. He also declared it was the duty of the United States to get Juarez into office and restore Mexico's peace for the benefit of the Mexican people. And how would the U.S. do this? Amazingly, he said he wanted to, quote, employ a sufficient military force to enter Mexico for the purpose of obtaining indemnity for the past and security for the future, end quote. The president then said this should be done with an army of volunteers who want to see Mexico succeed. Obviously, Bickley and the KGC were beaming. This was their opportunity. This was the time to finally realize their golden circle, and they were seemingly being backed by the president. But not all KGC leaders agreed, and the more politically savvy ones pretty much urged Bickley. They told him, the president isn't going to let us invade. He's going to have Congress form a completely separate army that would be under the president's command. So we need to invade now. Now or never. Shoot first, ask for forgiveness afterwards. In late January, one of these men, the commander-in-chief and president of the Texas Board of War of the Knights of the Golden Circle, a certain Elkanah Bracken Greer, he would write that 2 KGC regiments are, quote, ready to move immediately and take possession of the northern Mexican states of Tamaulipas, Nueva León, Coahuila, and Chihuahua, and of them organize a government, around which our valiant knights will soon rally, end quote. He concludes that, quote, the southern country, its bone and sinew, is ripe for the movement and will aid us, end quote. Greer wasn't just some knight. He had done a lot for the secret society. He had helped establish many a castle, and he'd recruited men and money from all over the South. He was well-connected and wealthy, and now he had 1,000 men ready to march at his command. Upon hearing this, Bickley rushed to New Orleans to meet with him. He asked Greer to hold off for a bit while he gathers more men from the east to send his way. But Greer wanted to move. Greer wrote to KGC member Sam Houston and told him of his plan, and then offered the governor his men, because Sam Houston was also planning his own Texan invasion into Mexico, mostly to stop runaway slaves from hiding there, but also to curb banditry from the failed states. The governor simply responded with, quote-unquote, we will see. Houston had recently sent Ben McCulloch to D.C. to meet with the president and ask him for financial aid in his endeavors to rid the state of Mexican bandits and hostile Indians. He also said, "There are 12,000 Texans ready to invade Mexico. Are we going to get any federal help?" Robert E. Lee had just been sent to San Antonio. But when he was approached about joining the Knights and invading Mexico, he wanted none of it, unless it was under the sanction of the U.S. government. The country was slowly learning about the KGC and Sam Houston's planned invasion. It was already in the newspapers. D.C. Republicans were, of course, calling it Southern fanaticism. But many in D.C. were very much for this little adventurism, this little adventure that was brewing. Although down in Mexico, now that it was actually about to happen, many northern governors and even Benito Juarez had changed their mind. Juarez didn't matter, though, at this time. He was holed up in Veracruz after a violent defeat that saw most of his army killed. The strongest supporter in the border states, though, Santiago Vidaurri, once the drums of war really began to beat, he backed out of the deal. One state, though, the mineral-rich Guanajuato, had recently made a deal with Bickley. So as far as the Americans thought, the plan was all coming together. In March of 1860, a planned KGC meeting took place in New Orleans to decide the fate of the invasion. By this point, the papers across the South loved the KGC. Half the editors were probably members. Congressmen spoke about them too. Newspapers praised them. One wrote that we must help out Juarez like the French helped us out in our revolution. But notably, this convention also criticized Bickley for not having delivered the funds and men he promised. And this forced George Bickley's hand. And he spent the next few weeks running around Alabama and Georgia looking for men and money, with only some success. Meanwhile, over in Texas, men from all over the South began to arrive en masse into what papers were calling the KGC Army. By April, 2,000 Southern men were encamped on the Rio Grande River. And over in New Orleans, almost 1,000 KGC men were waiting for a steamship to take them to the shores of Mexico. But alas, it was not meant to be. The Federals refused to give Houston any money, so he ordered the Knights to disband. The legislature were afraid of working with Mexico's liberal government because they'd be too close to the South if any hostilities broke out between the states. And then, Jefferson Davis's brother-in-law wrote a letter in the paper calling Bickley a fraudster and impostor. And Jefferson Davis's brother-in-law, Joseph Davis Howell, was not some nobody. First of all, he was 6'7". He was also a war hero from the Mexican-American War. He was a filibuster planner himself, and even a mercenary in California at one time. Over in New Orleans at the convention, which Bickley made it to the end of, he defended and explained himself. He said, "I was not ready for the invasion yet, that y'all pushed me to do so soon." Eventually, most KGC leaders would stick by Bickley, but this did somewhat tarnish his reputation. Although one newspaper said, quote, "Whatever the fate of General Bickley, we still have great faith in the Knights of the Golden Circle." End quote. By now, the KGC had a momentum of its own. It was going somewhere with or without General George Bickley. In May of 1860, in Raleigh, North Carolina, a quote-unquote final KGC meeting was to be held. Every castle was to send a delegate, and once there, they were to elect a permanent commander-in-chief for the KGC's military department. They were to elect a permanent financial chairman, to thoroughly organize the money department. They were going to elect a permanent president of the third or governing department, and provide a board of advisement. Shortly after that, Bickley resigned as commander-in-chief and president of the Knights of the Golden Circle. Although he would get to keep the title of president of the American Legion. At the convention, the society decided to decentralize, and each state was now in charge of its own affairs. Also, the Mexican adventure was shelved. Curiously, the convention decided that the KGC was going to be more open in the South about their designs and plans. At the time of the May convention, the KGC had in reality probably 8,300 men under arms that were willing to drill regularly in nearly every major city in the South, including Washington, D.C. And apparently it was quote-unquote within earshot of the president's house. 3,500 of those 8,300 were in Texas, and importantly to our story later, Arkansas. They were under the aforementioned gung-ho Greer. By the end of 1860, there would be substantial KGC support in Florida, Missouri, California, and a few other western states. The secret society that wasn't so secret anymore was growing. After the convention, Bickley published a 29-page pamphlet titled Address to the Citizens of the Southern States. This was the going to be more open part of the Knights going forward. In it, Bickley lays out the entire structure of the Knights and their prayers and even their goals. He states that the Americanization of Mexico will be very good for the South. He also promises that they are not going to reopen the slave trade. The address does defend the divine institution of slavery, as they put it, but it says they are not going to spread it to Mexico when they take it over. But he definitely defends the invasion of the Gulf states and of Mexico and of the coming empire. He says this invasion will ease the need for secession and provide an outlet for Southern territorial expansion. He wrote, quote, "The mere announcement that the KGC had crossed the Rio Grande or landed at Veracruz with a force of 10 or 15,000 men would of itself be sufficient to divert the attention of the nation from the bitter sectional strifes that now threaten us with civil war." End quote. Surprisingly, Bickley does admit in his address, though, that if the South were to secede, the KGC would be the perfect nucleus of a Southern army. He then says, with the KGC's help, if one state secedes, all will secede, and that the KGC will, quote, provide a vanguard in the great army of the South, which must be, at no distant day, brought into the field. End quote. By the end of summer, Bickley was writing to all these newspapers with increasing ridiculousness. He was telling all Southern men to go to Texas by September 15th for the next planned invasion. He wrote that the KGC flag will be flying over Mexico City by New Year's Day of 1861. He was greatly exaggerating the numbers of men again. At one point he said there were 65,000 KGC members in the South. He was a little bit of a mess. Yet, many papers took him at his word. The Norfolk Southern Argus said that if a black Republican president is elected, the glorious Southern Legion, or KGC, will take the initiative of rescuing the South from legalized wrong and oppression by guaranteeing the Southern states a peaceful withdrawal from a violated compact. End quote. And then to add fuel to the fire, in July, multiple massive actual fires broke out around Texas, which were at that time believed to have been set by slaves. And they were set by slaves who were told to do so by Northern abolitionists. Word spread like, well, wildfire. Spread throughout the South as newspapers began printing the vast slave uprising conspiracy. What became known as the Texas Terror was truly terrifying to the Texans. And this allowed the militant wing of the KGC to become a sort of secret police, which ran Republicans and Northerners out of many areas of the state. The Knights would even stop and search baggage from people arriving from the North. They were looking for abolitionist propaganda. Other Southern states followed suit as new castles were formed and more men signed up to become Knights. Stories of black and Northern abolitionist assassins were pervasive throughout the region. Pamphlets told how Northern teachers were infecting the Southern youth, and then more castles sprang up. The Murfreesboro Citizen would write in August that, quote, in every town and county in the Southern states, a sworn band of citizens, pledged under the sanctity of oath to defend our constitutional rights and to espouse the cause of the South against the North in the event of a sectional collision, end quote. The rhetoric was increasing. The South was gearing up for something, and the Knights would be there to defend the Cotton States. By October, Bickley was in Texas, definitely the KGC's strongest section. And by now, they'd dropped any precursors to creating an empire for the United States, and instead were focusing on creating an empire for the Southern states. Bickley, during a speech in Austin, compared the KGC to the Hudson's Bay Company, which founded entire nations for the British. So too will they do the same for the South, he said, especially if the black Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected president. In New Orleans on October 29th, 30,000 people attended a speech by the KGC fire eater, who espoused the right of secession and resistance. It was the largest attended speech ever given in the Crescent City up till that point. Well, election week came in November of 1860, and before the election, Bickley met with Greer and other prominent Texans to decide what to do if Lincoln won. Also in attendance was the head of the Virginia KGC, a lawyer and militia leader from Richmond named Virginius Groner. His militia were known as the Independent Greys. He also briefly fought Comanche with John Baylor as a Texas Ranger before returning to Virginia. Well, Virginius would write to Richmond newspapers, and they would publish what was going on down in Texas. He basically said, the invasion of Mexico is put on hold until we see who wins the presidential election. And if Lincoln loses, we will be off at once with plenty of money and men. If Lincoln wins, the KGC has been asked to focus on the home front. Now, there's an interesting story at this time. Right before the South learns of their fate after the election, the U.S. Army's Inspector General was touring Texas at this very moment, and apparently someone had infiltrated a KGC meeting, one of his men. This informer then ratted everything out to the Inspector General. And here's pretty much what the informer told him. He said, a bunch of Southern politicians, governors, and even men in Buchanan's presidency, including the vice president and the man running for president, John Breckinridge, they are all in the KGC. So was Jefferson Davis. And here's their plan. If Lincoln wins, they want to assault Washington and install Breckinridge as president. They're also going to seize Navy yards and ports throughout the South. The Inspector General quickly passed this up through the ranks, where it would reach the Lincoln administration, soon to be. And Lincoln's head of the army, Winfield Scott, would eventually take these threats to heart. So by November of 1860, the invasion of Mexico was off the table. Not just because of the impending war, but Juarez had won continually on the battlefield, and he'd win his Reform War in only 2 months' time. Now the plan, according to the informer, who was probably reliable, now the plan was to take Southern forts, ports, and even D.C. Even the ritual was changed in 1860 to reflect this. It now said, quote, the first field of our operation is Mexico, but we hold it to be our duty to offer our services to any Southern state to repel a Northern army. We hope such a contingency may not occur. End quote. Although the Texas KGC had their own new ritual around this time, maybe by early 1861, and it read, quote, the idea of expansion is as deep-rooted in the minds of the people of the North as in the South. Cuba, Mexico, and Central America are much coveted by the North in order that free soil states may be erected south of us. With her homestead bills, immigrant aid, and wide-awake societies, she well knows that she can people rich Mexico, Cuba, and fruitful Central America before our people could be able to settle up their businesses. No greater calamity could befall the South than the planting of free soil colonies in northern Mexico, as that would be the first step of hemming us in and thereby cutting off the only outlet for our peculiar institutions. To build up a great and powerful empire, such as the world has never witnessed, It is only necessary for us to acquire lands which will yield coffee, dyewoods, gold and silver, tea and small grains. These lands are within our reach, and the KGC would be the vanguard in their acquisition. We ask none but Southern men to assist us." End quote. Jefferson would be proud. Calhoun, on the other hand, would be disappointed in this goal. But I feel like that one sentence, to build up a great and powerful empire such as the world has never witnessed, that sounds like Jefferson's Empire of Liberty that I spoke about in the Pike series. Although Jefferson himself was not fond of slavery. I don't know the answer as of February 2026, but I assume I will find out once I complete my Mexican-American War series. But I wonder why Polk didn't keep and buy more of northern Mexico than he did after the war. Stay tuned. Most KGC castles, they had already switched to espousing the cause of the South. Around this time, the Texas Republican newspaper, as in Republic, not the party, but they printed that, quote, "Whenever the day of resistance comes, if come it must, there is not a southern state that cannot send forth, armed and equipped, 10,000 men, who have been accustomed to the use of arms from their youth. These men will scarcely be missed from among us, and yet they will constitute an army of 150,000 men, who, in point of efficiency, intelligence, discipline, determined valor, intrepidity, and all the elements that constitute a valuable army, will be superior to any force that has ever been sent to the field since the world began." End quote. The results of the election had still not reached Bickley and Texas by November 12th, when he wrote that if we find out that Lincoln had been elected, Bickley felt like it was the duty of the KGC to listen to their respective states on how to proceed. Then, only 3 days later, after learning that Lincoln had won the presidency with only 40% of the popular vote, Bickley wrote, "Thank God, the KGC organization is now in the hands of the people of the South." End quote. On the 16th, a day after the news hit Texas, Greer, leader of the KGC in that state, gave a speech about the diabolical North and the foul breath of abolitionism on the free-born and liberty-loving Southerners. Greer also said, "The overt act has been committed. Let the South speak now or forever hold her peace." Greer then gave up one of the 2 divisions of his castles to the soon-to-be-elected governor of South Carolina, his brother-in-law, a man who would immediately, after Lincoln's win, he would begin the call for secession. This governor, Francis Pickens, he would be in constant contact with Greer through the many times mentioned Ben McCulloch. I had no idea how central he was to the story of the lead-up to the Civil War until reading for this episode. This should have been episode 3 of my series over the Civil War, really. And it would have ended with them taking the Alamo. By December of 1860, Southern governors were ready to accept KGC militiamen into their own state militias, with Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas spearheading this step. They were only waiting for their legislatures to give the okay. But in the meantime, many states were scrambling to purchase arms and ammunition in anticipation of the coming conflict. The South also brought back the original Revolution's idea of committees of public safety, or Minutemen, with some states even writing them into their constitutions. By the end of November, it's estimated that 200,000 Southerners had signed on as Minutemen militia members for their states. These men would be ready at a moment's notice, even if it was midnight, to heed the call to fight if Northerners began rampaging through the South. The South Carolina Minutemen were headed by Jefferson Davis's cousin, and every member of the militia were to, quote, "solemnly pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor to sustain Southern constitutional equality in the Union, or failing that, to establish our independence out of it." End quote. South Carolina would have almost 10,000 Minutemen before 1861. And they were drilling, marching, parading, harassing Northerners, hanging abolitionists, and it was said, getting ready to march on D.C. The other Southern states followed suit, and make no mistake, the KGC were absolutely spearheading these Minutemen militias throughout the South, with many of them taking on the name of their city, followed by Grays, For instance, the Atlanta Grays or the Norfolk Grays. Maryland formed the National Volunteers, which was led by KGC members and very prominent politicians and men from that small state and the surrounding ones. Their goal was to ultimately march on D.C. The entire South was rapidly converting to a war footing. KGC Brigadier General Paul Seams would say, quote, "Let a united South rally and strike down this God-forsaken union with robbers, fanatics, incendiaries, assassins, infidels. Southrons, arise. Buckle on your armor, trust in God, and strike for independence." End quote. In December, President Buchanan spoke to Congress and basically said, if the North doesn't treat the South with respect, especially in terms of their property, the South, quote, would be justified in revolutionary resistance to the government of the Union. End quote. Towards the end of that year, 1860, the Secretary of the Treasury, Howell Cobb, a KGC member, was rumored to be squirreling away funds for the South. And Secretary of War John Floyd, also a KGC member, had been gathering arms and munitions for the southern states. The Secretary of War also placed a Southerner in the position of superintendent at West Point, and he filled the head position of the departments of New Mexico, Texas, and the Pacific in California with pro-Southerners. Floyd, too, would make sure that every southern state received their allotted full quota of militia material from the federal government by the end of December, before he left office. Lincoln had been well informed of all of this. His closest friend wrote to him and said, "I cannot but tremble for you." On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union, and they were now threatening to seize all forts both inland and in their harbors, specifically the thinly manned Fort Sumter. On Christmas Day of that year, Major Robert Anderson would secretly move all of his munitions from inland to the fort in the Charleston Harbor to protect it from increasingly dangerous South Carolinians. Obviously, this outraged the South, especially Secretary of War and KGC member Floyd. But Buchanan would stand by the decision. Floyd would resign before New Year's, and his resignation and the appointment of his successor would set off a chain reaction. His successor was an ardent Unionist named Holt. On January 2nd, 1861, Texas Senator and KGC admirer Louis Wigfall would telegraph Congressman Millage Bonham in Charleston and say, quote, "Holt succeeds Floyd. It means war. Cut off supplies from Anderson and take Sumter as soon as possible." End quote. 20 federal forts and arsenals were soon seized. In the meantime, on January 9th, Mississippi would secede. On the 10th, Florida, the 11th, Alabama, the 19th, Georgia, the 26th, Louisiana, and February 1st, Texas. By mid-January, rumors and news spread throughout Maryland and D.C. that the KGC and its militia would soon seize the capital and install either Breckinridge or Jefferson Davis as president. D.C. was surrounded by Maryland and Virginia, two southern states that it was assumed would secede, although neither had. Maryland had yet to hold a secession to declare this, and Virginia wouldn't secede until April 17th. Maryland, surrounded by northern states and Virginia, could not secede before Virginia. But the KGC and Southern secessionists were certainly pressing the moderate governor, Thomas Holiday Hicks, to do just that. Meanwhile, hundreds of heavily armed militiamen in D.C. were drilling and preparing to seize the U.S. Treasury Department building. They were armed with 2 mountain howitzers, which had been given to them by Floyd before he resigned. It was also rumored that Ben McCulloch had hundreds of men under arms in Virginia, ready to cross the Potomac. But this whole plot was quickly brought to an end by the new Inspector General, Colonel Charles Stone. The members of the militia then fled to Alexandria and teamed up with the militiamen there. But many Southerners and KGC members still wanted to assassinate Lincoln before he could even take office. This plot was also foiled, but this time with the help of a certain Allan Pinkerton and his agents, who successfully infiltrated nearly all of these assassination plots. Pinkerton will come up again in the next episode, when he pursues Jesse James. So now we shift to Texas, although I won't spend too much time there because I have already outlined the KGC's successful taking of the Department of Texas. But many men I spoke about in that series were KGC members. Thomas Green, a man I admired in the Civil War series. Texas Ranger John Ford. Of course, Ben McCulloch and John Baylor. By early 1861, there were 8,000 knights in Texas, and all of them were ready to secede and defend their homeland. The KGC were instrumental in getting Texas to secede, and then form their Committee of Public Safety. The vote at the convention was 166-8 in favor. And then the overwhelmingly KGC force of 1,100 men took the Alamo. I read that 4/5 of the men were KGC. But what I had not previously read is this little anecdote that I will let Keene tell y'all. Earlier that afternoon, an unsuspecting U.S. Army Colonel, Robert E. Lee, who had been assigned to the Department of Texas several months before, rode into San Antonio. Lee was shocked to see the town occupied by McCulloch's men with their red insignias. McCulloch's men told Lee of Twiggs' surrender and then said he was a prisoner of war. McCulloch tried to convince Lee to join the Confederacy, but Lee, who opposed secession, said he owed his allegiance to the United States. A few weeks later, Lee was allowed to head to Washington, where he faced an anguished decision. General-in-Chief Scott offered Lee command of the U.S. Army, but Lee instead decided to resign his commission in favor of his native state of Virginia. End quote. The Dallas Herald would write of the surrender, and they would say, "Hurrah for the noble band of KGC, who in the hour of need proved themselves so prompt and striking for the rights of the South." End quote. The 2,681 men that had been stationed in Texas made up a whopping 20% of the U.S. Army. If the Texans had held them captive, it would have severely hampered the North's war effort. But instead, the men of Texas said that these troops had been stationed to protect Texans from Indians and Mexicans, and that they were, quote-unquote, our friends. Therefore, they were allowed to board ships and leave. After Texas was taken, it was divided into 3 military districts, and of course, each district was headed by a prominent member of the KGC. With this tremendous win under their belt, the Knights now planned to use this model again in Arkansas, Oklahoma, or Indian Territory, and ultimately the crown jewel, California. In Arkansas, the leader of the Knights was a true fire-eating Southern secessionist and filibusterer who fought in the Mexican-American War. He was U.S. Congressman Thomas Heineman. Arkansas would secede on May 6th, under Heineman's and the KGC's direction. To the west in Oklahoma, the KGC was particularly active amongst the Cherokees on the eastern side of the state, specifically the mixed-blood Cherokees, which made up about a third of the tribe. I mean, if you'll remember, the last Confederate general to surrender after the war was Cherokee Brigadier General and KGC member Stand Watie. By March of 1861, the Confederate government had formed a BIA, or their own Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they sent Ben McCulloch and Albert Pike to get the 5 civilized tribes to join the ranks of the rebels. Half of the Creeks did, and ultimately the Cherokees under Ross would. And these Indians, all the tribes that joined the Confederacy, were because of the Supreme Freemason Albert Pike. And although I haven't talked much about him, just know that Pike, with his wealth, political ties, and social ties, pretty much ran this whole entire conspiracy of starting the Civil War. Or at least, a few people have claimed that. And it does seem somewhat legit, although many other factors and forces contributed. In California and Oregon, 1/3 of the population was Southern. Northern California was filled with Knights that were farmers, editors, judges, local officials, mayors, and even sheriffs. The first California senator to the U.S. was a Knight, and an ex-governor was also a Knight. And Southern California saw Los Angeles and the San Bernardino Valley filled with Southern Knights. All told, there were probably 16,000 Knights of the Golden Circle in California, which is where I got that number of Southern sympathizers in previous series. They had mostly gone over during the Gold Rush, where they formed castles and stayed true to the South. And as you'll hear about in the 3rd episode, some of them may have even been sent by the KGC to accumulate wealth for the South. One noted hotbed of KGC activity was in the town of El Monte, near Los Angeles. And that will come up a lot in the 3rd episode. Southern Oregon had 10 castles and an estimated 2,500 Knights. Northern California and Southern Oregon at one point wanted to create a separate Pacific Republic, which would have been led by the KGC. Eventually, these Pacific Knights wanted to seize all federal forts and ammunition with the help of Albert Sidney Johnston, who was head of the Department of the Pacific at the time. And I have gone over this, and I tell many people who ask how the South could have won. I normally tell them it would have been, I'm not sure it could have ever won, but it would have been bolstered heavily by Johnston giving the command over to the Knights of the Golden Circle and the 16,000 Southern sympathizers, many of who were very wealthy from all the gold. Lincoln acted quickly, though. He relieved Johnston, gave the command over to Sumner, who immediately moved all heavy ordnance to Alcatraz. He then called in federal troops from Oregon, Washington, and California, and he set up heavy defenses in every major city. So that plot was dead in the water. Johnston would travel to New Mexico and fight with Baylor before leaving for the East. Jefferson Davis had once called him the most capable officer in the U.S. Army. Over in Virginia, the Knights were gathering support for secession. They were forming more militias, gathering more arms, spying on Unionists, and turning the state slowly toward leaving the Union. The Knights and their allies made speeches, printed circulars, and railed during conventions against the encroachment and illegality of the North. But the secessionists still did not have the numbers. That is until the war began on April 12th, when South Carolina bombarded Fort Sumter. Word of this reached Virginia the following day, and on the 14th, the South Carolina Governor Pickens telegraphed the wavering Virginia Governor, Letcher, and he said, quote, "The war has commenced, and we will triumph or perish. Please let me know what Virginia will do." End quote. On the 15th, Lincoln would ask the Union for 75,000 troops to put down the rebellion. Virginia was to provide 2,340. Governor Letcher responded that the state would provide no such troop support, and he told the president, "You have chosen to inaugurate civil war." On April 17th, after quite a few electric speeches and a few federal posts being taken, the Virginia legislature voted to secede, and then a popular vote ratified it on May 23rd. After the announcement, former U.S. President John Tyler led a chant, "Independence or death." On the 19th, Yankee troops passing through Baltimore on their way down south were attacked by hundreds of Virginians and Marylanders, and this prompted the soldiers to fire into the crowd, killing 4 and wounding dozens more. The Maryland leader of police sent a telegram asking for even more militiamen to defend Baltimore from the Northerners. The KGC would be blamed for the unrest, but by the end of the day, Baltimore would fully be in the control of secessionists. Railroad bridges to the north were burned, and telegraph wires were cut. By April 22nd, the Yankee troops were ordered to abandon the outskirts of the city. But in the meantime, They had rebuilt the railroad bridges and were waiting for orders to invade. At the same time, 1,000 Baltimore militiamen, most likely led by KGC leaders, were ready to fight the soldiers. By June, though, the Federals were in control of the city, and the Southern sympathizers headed south to muster in the Confederate Army. I would drag this episode on for entirely too long if I described how many Southern military leaders that rose through the ranks during the war were members of the Knights of the Golden Circle. But the importance cannot be overstated. And the South's ability to raise armies so quickly was in a large part due to the KGC's militia infrastructure. This was especially true in Texas, but it's important to know that in about 5 months, the Knights of the Golden Circle turned a small group of Southern secessionists willing to fight into 200,000 rabid supporters. By the summer of 1861, it seems the oath to join the KGC had again changed. It now stated, "I will not rest or sleep until Abraham Lincoln, now president, shall be removed out of the presidential chair, and I will wade in blood up to my knees as soon as Jefferson Davis sees proper to march with his army to take the city of Washington and the White House." End quote. As the war began in earnest, Bickley was in Kentucky, which was neutral. He was trying to get that state to secede using the Knights. But ultimately, he will fail, and by the end of 1861, Kentucky would be in the hands of the Union. Bickley would flee to Virginia, where he'd try to raise a battalion of light dragoons, but that would also fail. He would then become a surgeon in Tennessee in 1863. And around this time, Bickley would write, quote, "I was thrown on the world penniless and friendless, yet with great energy I educated myself, and rose to eminence in the profession of medicine. I have written many books and vast quantities of minor essays on all conceivable subjects. I have built up practical secession and inaugurated the greatest war of modern times." End quote. In the South, as the war raged, the KGC castles became less and less attended, although up north in border states they began to spring up. States like Missouri, which you'll hear about in the next episode. But these weren't meant to last, and the Union forces and governors and leaders arrested anyone suspected of being the leader of a castle. Even still, the KGC had done its work in the North and had even possibly facilitated a Confederate invasion known as Morgan's Raid. By the time of Pickett's charge, every Northerner was afraid a KGC agent was behind every tree. Newspapers continued to print that they were active and always ready to infiltrate Northern governments. KGC militiamen were always on the march behind enemy lines. The North feared the war had come to their soil. But in July of 1863, the crackdown had come for Bickley himself, and he was arrested in New Albany, Indiana. He would eventually be moved to the Ohio State Penitentiary before sitting in jail in the New York City harbor. So, the KGC is done, right? Well, not so much. Without going into too much detail, in 1863, the same year it seemed the KGC was fading, something known as the Order of American Knights, or OAK, formed in the border, Midwestern, and some southern states. It was pretty much the exact same thing as the KGC. Structured the same, similar mission, similar oaths, etc. A Union spy infiltrated it later that year, and apparently, a member told him, the OAK was just a restructured KGC. And it had been formed by Confederate Major General Sterling Price, since the KGC was too unsafe to be a part of these days. That's what the spy said, but it may not be true. Although many KGC members may have went and joined the OAK, but in reality they were two separate entities. And by 1864 the OAK would merge with the Sons of Liberty. Southerners adamantly denied that the OAK was the successor to the KGC. But all that being said, in that same year, as the war dragged on and was looking worse and worse for the South, Jefferson Davis sent emissaries up to Canada, where OAK, now Sons of Liberty, was headquartered. He sent them there to gauge the level of subterfuge the Sons of Liberty was willing to participate in. Would they destroy infrastructure, cut telegraph lines, sink steamboats, free the 26,000 Confederate prisoners of war that were held in the North? The men who met made grand and incredible plans that included forming a separate confederacy in the Northwest, or our Midwest today, and even forming another one in the Pacific. In other words, total balkanization. But of course, the plans were leaked and the leaders were arrested. In New York City, they did start quite a few fires, but 10,000 Union soldiers showed up and arrested the insurgents in November of 1864. Interestingly, one man did meet up with these Confederate and SOL leaders in Canada, a man who witnessed the hanging of John Brown. He got to do that by using his KGC connections. He was a man who failed to join the Confederacy as a soldier on account of his mother's disapproval. He's a man who was a very well-known Southern sympathizing actor who was described as extremely graceful and charming. A man named John Wilkes Booth. Booth met these spies and Confederate Secret Service men in Montreal in October of 1864. He would leave the meeting with $300 in gold. During the war, Booth had used his connections in both government and society and the KGC to smuggle medicine to the South. But now, this late into the conflict, he and his actor friends had other ideas that were probably given to them. They were going to kidnap the tyrant Lincoln. By this time, Booth was fully on board with not only kidnapping but also assassination. He once claimed he wanted to stick his dagger in the neck of Lincoln. So here's a great quote from Keene about Booth's meeting in Canada and his associates. While in Canada, Booth is known to have spent time with two Southern zealots. One was George Sanders, a native Kentuckian, who had been a leading spirit in the Democrats' Young America movement during the mid-1850s. Sanders advocated the use of assassination to end autocratic tyranny and achieve political ends. He had reportedly threatened to apply the theory of the dagger, derived from Italian revolutionary Giuseppe Mazzini, to the hated black Republican president in the event of Lincoln's re-election. The other zealot was Patrick Charles Martin, a former Baltimore liquor dealer described as an uncompromising rebel, who had been in Canada for several years after being released from arrest in Baltimore. In Canada, Martin operated as a blockade runner and Confederate abateur. Booth gave Martin his theatrical wardrobe to be shipped to a southern port, where Martin provided Booth with the name of Dr. William Queen from southern Maryland. In a few weeks, Queen would introduce Booth to Dr. Samuel Mudd, who would later aid in Booth's post-assassination escape. End quote. In 1865, Booth convinced even more Southern sympathizers to join his plot. At one point, Booth claimed that there were 35 men ready to help him kidnap the president and take him to Richmond, where the South could better negotiate a peace deal. But the abduction plan was foiled. On the prescribed night, Lincoln changed his plans and stayed in D.C. And then the Yankee Army placed Richmond under siege. So where would they even take the U.S. president if the Confederate president was stuck in Richmond? If the Confederate government, was under siege, were they even still a government able to dictate any terms at all? After Booth heard of the siege on April 3rd, he decided kidnapping was not an option. There was only one thing left to do. On April 14th, John Wilkes Booth put a bullet in the back of Lincoln's head as he watched Our American Cousins at Ford's Theater. And the rest is history. An overwhelming majority of the men involved in the plot to kidnap Lincoln were once members of the KGC. But when that failed, many or possibly most of the men who pledged to help Booth escape were once KGC. Many of the men admitted it later, and many others were suspected of it. But so were so very many men of the South prior to the war, especially influential men who helped create one of the greatest armies the world has ever seen. That is, of course, my bias. But history does indeed prove that out. So was Booth acting on behalf of the KGC, which had gone super secret underground around the capital of the invaders? Booth's granddaughter certainly thinks the KGC was behind him. She wrote this in 1937, quote, "After 40 years of ceaseless research to find new material and verify reports and rumors, I have come to the following conclusions. That Lincoln's assassination was instigated by men high in the order of the Knights of the Golden Circle, said to have been a branch of Freemasonry, flourishing in the North as well as in the South." End quote. While it is true, many of the conspirators had once been KGC, most of the Knights' leaders in the Maryland and Virginia area had been killed during the war, or were too active in trying to defend their land from the Yankees. It's most likely that Booth and his former Knight friends did this on their own, or possibly with the blessing of the Confederate Secret Service, which was probably heavily influenced by the Knights of the Golden Circle. Bickley suffered in prison, and over time backtracked the importance of the KGC in the lead-up to the Civil War. Even though he said that he was instrumental in setting off the greatest war in history. He was finally released in October of 1865, but 2 years later he would die in Baltimore. He was never charged with the crime. Even before the end of the Civil War, though, the KGC was planning a future Confederate comeback. In 1864, the highest military justice system figure, Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt, he published a report regarding the KGC. And that report suggested there were 500,000 Northerners in the KGC at that time, and many of them were drilled and ready to fight for the South. Again, that may have been the goal of the aforementioned Morgan's raid, a raid into the North to rally the KGC men, but ultimately that did not pan out. This report also probably correctly identifies the KGC as being the driving factor in the Civil War occurring in the first place. But towards the end of the document, Holt states, quote, "A citizen captured by a guerrilla band in Kentucky last summer records the fact that the establishment of a new confederacy as the deliberate purpose of the Western people was boastfully asserted by these outlaws, who also assured their prisoner that in the event of such establishment there would be a greater rebellion than ever. Lastly, it is claimed that the new confederacy is already organized, that it has a provisional government, officers, departments, bureaus, etc., in secret operation." End quote. For many, at that time, the South will rise again, and the KGC was going to be there to prop it up. But where did all this money come from? To start with, Albert Pike had received $190,000 for a court case, and biographers of his claimed that he'd never invested that sum, nor paid off any debts. Pike also had great ties with the Indian tribes in future Oklahoma. These ties to Pike and the Confederacy would last long after the war ended, and they would be useful for the dormant KGC. And when Waddy, the hardened and awesome Confederate Cherokee leader, surrendered, finally, none of his army had any guns or cannons. All the war materiel had either been lost or buried. During the war, Pike would retire and live in a house next to the Little Missouri River in the Ouachita Mountains of Arkansas, the same place we opened this episode with, where Bob grew up and eventually returned, and then later found gold. But as you'll hear in the next episode, when he goes to Albert Pike's house, there's more gold buried. And that's because at one point during the war, marauders had heard that Pike had a chest full of gold. Pike was warned, though, as they were coming, and apparently he fled with it. Or maybe he buried it. But as Pike fled in the dead of night, he paid his informers in handfuls of gold coins. Once the war was over, many Confederate leaders wanted to see the South rise again. But when the Reconstruction regime took over, they were forced to bury their gold, wealth, and guns. And there was a lot of unaccounted for wealth and gold once the Confederacy fell. And even after it fell, ex-rebels continued to gain wealth by raids, bank robberies, train robberies, and stagecoach robberies from the North to the Wild West, which you'll hear all about in the next episode. Gettler, the writer of Bob Brewer's book, also posits that after the war, the Knights of the Golden Circle either became or used the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. He writes, quote, "There can be little doubt that the hidden KGC spawned the original KKK. Ample circumstantial evidence supports this. There is the ever-important symbolic trail and the persistent whiff of a familiar modus operandi." End quote. I'm not totally sold on it, but in the next episode I will go into his reasons for saying that, and it is compelling, and it might be true. The leaders of the KKK certainly were, at one time, KGC members. But what I am sold on is Pike's heavy involvement in the Knights of the Golden Circle. Bickley, it turns out, may have just been a front man. Pike was a genius by all accounts. He was adept at math. He was into alchemy. He could read Greek and Hebrew and Sanskrit. He was into the Kabbalah of all things. And again, he was a 33rd degree Mason who wrote the book on Freemasons. Just ask Bill Cooper how he feels about the man. And it seems that after the war, when the Confederates buried their gold, they used an ingenious system to do so. A system devised by Pike. Gettler describes this system thusly: a geometrically based grid of monumental ingenuity that involved hundreds of secretly coded underground financial depositories scattered across the South and Southwest. End quote. Pike had lived in these Ouachita Mountains. He had also spent extensive time in New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. And after the war, he will spend over a decade traveling the entire United States, from the East to the South, to the Midwest, to the Southwest, and even the Pacific coast. But again, where'd all this gold come from? Selling cotton to Mexico certainly brought a lot of silver coins to the South, and as the war turned for the worse, they may have began hoarding it and eventually hiding it. And amazingly, it could have come from KGC treasure hunters who were said to travel after the war to Spain and Mexico to read through dusty records in the hopes of finding trails to lost treasure in the Southwest and Texas. Treasure stolen from Spanish mines and from Indian hordes. They then walked the landscape as Bob did in search of buried loot. But another source is no doubt former Confederate and KGC member and Freemason Jesse James. James and his gang, it seemed, never got rich from all their bold and daring robberies, so no one really knows what happened to all their plunder. Except maybe Bob Brewer knows. After all, he had just found a jar full of gold coins. Well, Bob knows, and his relatives knew. What if ex-rebs and KGC men brilliantly and systematically buried their loot throughout the countryside, from Georgia to California, even in Pennsylvania and Baltimore? What if they buried their loot using Pike's grid system and KGC and Masonic symbols that they carved on trees and rocks? And then KGC leaders had men and their sons for generations. They had them guard these treasure hoards until the time was right for the South to rise again. In the next episode, we will continue to follow Bob as he discovers more treasure and systematically cracks the code of the maps while learning a little bit of history about his family. And then the last 2/3 of the next episode will be a pretty in-depth biography of the outlaw and rebel hero Jesse James. Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest.
Came down from Alamosa, across the Rio Grande, to track a killer lion, lost his fear, man. First seen around El Rito, he laid a rancher down, killed the rancher's daughter, was gone out of sound. And the purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Not much trace of man out here, the painted canyon walls, the ancient pagan hunters show the chase and fall. Now the lever action rifle and horses change the game, but their ghosts still hunt beside me, the chase still feels the same. And the purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the hounds my father left me are ranging out of sight. I stand up in my saddle in the early morning light. I can see the good gyp circle, and I know it won't be long till the canyon rings are striking cry, the lion will be found. Purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Finds a lonely juniper to make his final stand. 3 faithful hounds lie dying, blood shining on the sand. And the good gyp leaps up in the air, as low as murder charge. My rifle cracks, a whisper late, I can feel his iron jaw. The purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the eagle sees us falling, the hunter and the prey. His shadow crosses lifeless bodies, where side by side we lay. And the good gyp sits upon the rim, and all alone she cries a death song for her master, killed the mighty lion. Purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Yeah, the purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds.